a little bit of the skin texture there. On the fur. Hi, I'm Leila. Welcome back to my channel. Today's follow along tutorial will be another one of those relaxing and ASMR-ish kind of tutorials. Today we will use graphite pencils on white paper. I hope you get to relax and enjoy, whether you decide to follow along or just sit back and watch. Today we are going to draw an ostrich. It's going to be more of an ostrich portrait, and I'm going to do it with graphite pencils and other graphite materials. If you are a complete beginner and you need to see a video on graphite materials and all the other materials I will be using here in this video, please check out this video that I'm going to link in the corner there before you start. Otherwise, if you've already know your stuff, let's go. I'm going to start with the rough structure, but I'm not going to go in detail explaining about this because I already have a video on that. That video is on Patreon, so please remember to check my Patreon page out because there are different options available where you can support me and where you can go in the draw to win some of the sketches that I complete here or see extra videos. So please go and check it out. So the beak, a rough placement for the eyes. And just like with anything else, whether you're drawing a landscape, a portrait, a still life, you always start with a rough shape and then you get more and more into the detail. I've never realized there were like separate layers on the beak, which is quite interesting. Roughly sketched most of my placements. I'm going to start removing some of the lines that are getting in the way, that I don't need anymore, that help me with structuring, but now they have served their purpose, and if we keep them around they're just going to be getting in the way of all the other things. I'm also, while I'm doing this, I'm also going to go and I'm going to softly lighten some of the lines that I have drawn. I don't want to erase them completely, you know, I still want them to be visible to me. I hope they're still visible to you guys through the lens, but if I leave them on really strong, you know, they would be causing more trouble as well. So something like this where you can kind of still see them, but they're not going to be breaking through all the sketching that we are going to do next. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to start applying shadows and dark spots, because dark areas can be shadows, you know, natural sort of areas where the light doesn't hit, you know, because there's something blocking it, and there's also natural dark areas which are for example darker fur or darker skin, or you know, darker bits like eyes, you know, they might be darker than the feathers. So applying some of these darker areas. I'm not focusing too much on the, you know, the feathers. It's really funny because on ostriches it looks like fur kind of, So I'm not focusing on that too much, but I'm not doing anything that would go against the growth direction or anything like that either. So I'm just softly shading things. I'm not getting into too much detail, it's too early for that, just marking some of the darker areas. So at this stage you can see it's just pretty much blocking certain areas, and I'm not going as dark as they are on my reference image. I am just going somewhat lightly over these areas, and I'm not creating too much contrast at this stage. It will, there will be time for that, but a bit later. So now I'm going to go in with my smudge stick and I'm going to soften. I'm not blending them out completely because some of these areas might come in handy. Some of the marks that I'm making. But I also want to create that sort of an overall almost block-like effect, where most of it has some kind of a tone underneath. I'll do the eye later when we get to more detail. Now I'm going to go back in with the same pencil. So in the beginning it's always good to use pencil that's not too soft and not too hard. So something about like B, 2B is absolutely fine for sketching. And so now this pencil is 6B, so it's reasonably soft. So I can achieve dark shades with it if I need to. You see how this layer now that I'm applying, I'm taking much more care when I'm depicting the little strands of fur, feathery fur. With every next layer, you, again, even with shading, you get more and more into the detail, but you don't start with these fine details straight from the beginning. A little bit more detail around the eyes. Leathery sort of a folds that you can see. I know some people like to tape their paper to the board, you know, that they would be working on. I don't personally like to do that because I do like to rotate my artwork, as you can see, because it helps me to prevent from extra smudging and maybe getting into specific places. And also sometimes you have to think of the direction of your hand. Again, I have a video on that on Patreon, so you can check that out if you'd like. But I think it is quite important to have something that you can move around, especially if the work size allows for it. I mean, of course, if you're working on something that's 2 meters by 2 meters, you know, it has to be quite stationary. But with something of this size, you don't want to limit yourself by sticking it down. And now time for more blending. I'm going to use a little bit of paper, this side actually, so that I can lay my hand without necessarily smudging all of this. So now I'm going into more detail with this mechanical pencil. And of course here you can use your cross-hatching techniques, you can use any kind of shading technique that you feel more comfortable with, or you feel it's more appropriate for these areas. And because now I am working on more details, as you can see, you know, most of it is there. I can focus on specific areas and really perfect them. And for that reason, I'm also going to be using the putty rubber as well. So some areas where I'd want to bring in a little bit more light or a little bit more shade, that's what I will use. So some putty rubber for highlights and an 8B pencil for some of the darker areas. So see here I am paying more attention to, you know, some of the 3D shapes. And remember, on the drawing, the only way that you can depict and show these 3D forms is by applying shadow and light. So making some areas darker and creating highlights by leaving some areas quite white. Now I can see that on my reference image, some of the darker areas are actually where the skin is showing through. So just around the eyelids. It's not too dark, but it's definitely darker than the fur. A little bit of the skin texture there. I know that there are lots of ostrich farms and emu farms in Australia. So if any of you who are watching from Australia have ever done any kind of ostrich breeding, that would be interesting to hear. Any interesting stories on that? And you see how the more of the shadow and the light that we apply on the paper, the more that the object that you are drawing or the subject that you are drawing is more recognizable, and also it just comes to life, kind of, you know, you sort of you see more of the shapes. It gets its volume. Okay, let's apply some more highlights. So some of the highlights, you know, where the light bounces off the skin. And now what I'm doing is I'm pretty much creating more of that fur effect, but rather than using a pencil, I am using the putty rubber. It's so funny because this area kind of looks like a little cheek or something on him. Now this rubber is so great for doing little things like that, but it's not so perfect for if you want to get back to the really, really bright highlights. For that it's better to use something like this, where you can take it back to the way to the state of the paper before you applied anything. And I have discussed using the feather, I think, in one of my Patreon videos, but it's actually quite funny drawing a bird and using the feather to get rid of the little razor bit. Okay, so now I'm going to go back in with the mechanical pencil again. Now this one's a softer lead, and really bring out those tiny little details that are, that capture quite a bit of shadow on them. This line here is really dark, so even though it's thin, it's dark, so using something like this is perfect. If you don't use mechanical pencils but you are following along, you can always take a little break and sharpen one of your regular pencils really, really well for this area. I also find that sharpening your regular pencils with a knife is much more convenient, and you get a better result than using a sharpener. Okay, so what I've done now is I've lifted my board up a little bit more, because I think graphite, when you look at it at a certain angle, it starts to reflect a lot of light, so you cannot, the camera cannot register the shade, the appropriate shade, and it looks quite light. So whenever you're drawing anything, whether you're drawing from life, from photograph, or even your imagination, which is not advisable, by the way, if you're learning how to draw things. You need to make sure that you always look not just at the dark shadows, but always pay a lot of attention to the semi-shadows as well, because that's what actually gives you that three-dimensional look. Because if you only have highlights and you've got the darkest shadows, you pretty much get an outline on paper, which makes your drawings look very flat. So what you want to do is you want to make sure that you pay a lot of attention to those, shades in between the dark and the light, those grays. It's quite funny because you know what they say in life, nothing's ever black and white. There's always lots of other shades in between, kind of the same in drawing as well. So there's a bit of a shadow underneath the eye, because the eyes kind of pop out a little bit. So as a consequence of that, there are shadows on the opposite side of the light source. Now I'm going to go into the details of the fur. So you know how I've done few layers already. We've built everything up. Make sure you don't skip those, they're very important. And now I'm going to apply these hairs, sort of going into the detail with, at times, maybe quite a bit of pressure on the pencil, and at times really soft. But that's what you really need to do at this stage. And here on that side, I can see eyelashes from that other eye that we can't actually see, and they're quite dark. They've got such beautiful eyelashes. One says cows have beautiful eyelashes, but these guys are quite crazy too. And now I'm going to go in with a 9B and really darken just that little bit there, and a little bit here. Also there's like a really sort of a dark gap through there as well. And now I'm moving on to this area, so I'm pretty much just moving around. So whenever you're drawing fur, feathers or anything like this, you always need to work in the direction of that fur growth, and always look at the texture, like is it a really long, very silky, very shiny sort of a coat, or is it quite feathery like this one here, or perhaps it's just really soft or maybe curly. And so depending on what texture you have, that's how your pencil should move. So I will be making more videos in the future, of course, with different textures and different feathers and things like that for you to see, so you'll be able to see the difference of how you treat different textured furs and hairs and things like that. So as I'm going through, I'm number one looking at the dark and the lighter area, so that I'm still applying shadows, but I'm also looking at the texture. And what I want to do now is I want to grab one of my smaller, thinner smudging sticks, and because the fur is so soft, well, it's got that, the way it reflects light is soft. I don't know if it's soft to touch, but as I said, if you had close dealings with ostriches, please comment and let me know. But I can only go by what it looks like on my reference image. and I can see that it's quite chaotic, so it's going, in different directions, and it's going in one direction, but it's slightly so wavy. And I also want to correct the shape a little bit as well. And going back to using my pencil. You can see little skin folds on the eyelids, so you can put them in if that's what you want, of course, because everyone probably has a preference to the level of detail they're happy to work with. Some people go hyper realism, where things look even more detailed than they do in real life, so it kind of, in one way, it flattens the image, and on the other, it brings a lot of things that you would normally miss in real life to your attention. But on the other, if you just want an essence of something, then you want to try and stay away from the really fine details, because they interrupt the way you capture all of this information with your eyes. So if you want to just get the essence of what this animal is, then you want to stay away from the these tiny little details that I'm actually placing there. And whenever I'm on on other social media platforms, when people share their art, you can see there's just so much discourse about should things be very detailed or should they not be? Do you use large brush strokes or do you go in with little brushes? And I just think it's a personal preference. So just because you do it this way, it doesn't mean that everyone else has to, or that everyone has to like it as well. So you have to remember, it's your personal preference. Perhaps it's something that maybe you enjoy. Like some people just can't be bothered with details. They've got their main thing there and they feel it's complete, then that's what it is for you. If you are working on something and you're a lot like me, your favorite part is when you come to the finishing details, then skipping details is going to be really detrimental, for you even to keep up doing things, because it's your favorite part. Why would you cheat yourself out of it? So then do that. It doesn't matter what critics say, that all works should be done in the manner of impressionism or something else. You do what you do. There's no such thing as one art movement is right and the other one is wrong. So now I'm going to do the eye. You can do things like eyes and things like that later, when everything is done. But again, because I'm working on this artwork and I don't want to finish all of this here and then go back to here and smudge everything. And even though, I'm using this paper, and this paper does help with the smudging problem, you still press, it still moves around, that transfer still happens. So I would rather finish the eye now, or not necessarily finish, but do quite a bit of work on that. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to show where the pupil is going to be. It's quite hard to see because the eye is really dark brown, and then I'm going to have the highlight and mark that, and then I'm just going to start just really softly shading things. And because it's a white of the eye, but it's not that white, it's actually quite sort of a gray, bluey gray, but because we're not using colors, we are focusing mainly on the on the shades, on the values. Okay, so we've got this covered more or less. Now I'm going to go in and I'm going to mark the pupil. Now because eyes are quite dark, you can't really see the pupil that well, so I'm just going to shade all around it, because it almost looks like it's a little bit hazy and smudged. Now I'm going to bring in just a little bit more detail before I go for my smudge stick. It's quite interesting, but the iris actually looks almost quite outlined. Okay, so now I'm going to go in with my smudge stick and soften this and this a bit. I'm also going to place a little bit of the highlights, and also I'm going to highlight some of the other areas. Just a little bit just around, and then from here I'm actually going to use this rubber now for this highlight. And with a really dark pencil, I'm going just to shade this in here. And I'm going to, remember as we said, there are really long eyelashes. So with this pencil, I'm just creating that overall shade. And then with a small pencil, I'm going to get some of the details in. Quite interestingly enough, you can really see where these eyelashes are growing from. Adding more shadow. Wow, that's quite interesting. They even have the lower lashes. And you see, that's the thing when people say, I get so many comments like this, guys, from you. When you say, I have trouble drawing, I can't, everything I draw seems to be really flat. And then I find out from you that you are drawing from your memory. That's one of the reasons why it is so hard and sometimes pretty much impossible to draw from your memory. Like, for example, now I have an image in front of me, right? And as I'm drawing, until I've come to look at this area so closely as to see the bottom eyelashes, I didn't even notice it, even having an image in front of me. Now, how can you remember something like this? You know, it's not possible. So unless you've been drawing ostriches your whole life, then perhaps you would be able to create a really detailed, very convincing image in a drawing or painting of an ostrich. But if you haven't done thousands of those sketches, then you really need point of reference. Yes, of course you can change things, you know. Even when I work on my surrealistic stuff, I change things around, you know, because I don't want things to be like they are in real life. But I still need a reference to see how the shadows go, what the texture is like, and so on. So it's really important to have a reference in front of you. And especially when you are just starting out. And you see, you always go back. So for example, now that I've finished the eye, I realize that this area here is much darker than what it is. So even though you can say, okay, I've finished this area for now, you would have to get back to it once the other areas around are finished. So some more of these little curled up bits on the foot. I personally always find looking at birds so strange, you know. You can really see that fact that, you know, dinosaurs closely related to birds. You can really see that, because there's something a little bit scary. Like even when you look at their legs and things, you can see how reptile-like they are. So now as I'm going down on my further on the fur, again I'm adding more details, and I'm closely monitoring how dark I'm going as well, because I don't want to go too dark and I don't want to leave some areas too light as well, because remember, that's the only thing that's helping us to show that your object that you're drawing is actually three-dimensional, because you are trying to reproduce a 2D surface. Okay, now let's so you see, at this stage I'm going quite softly with the pencil. I'm not creating too much texture, because I can always go back in with the eraser or with the pencil and create more. That's exactly what I'm going to do. I'm going to add little highlights to portray individual hairs or strands of hair. I don't know what's the correct way to say it, because hair, I don't know, hairs, it sort of doesn't sound right. Hairs. Okay, so more over here. And a little bit more over here. And going back to this and carrying on in a very similar way to what I did on all of these areas, showing more texture and more of the direction of the fur. Just getting rid of these little annoying eraser bits. That's another little thing that goes in favor of the putty rubber. It doesn't leave any of those little bits flying around. Whenever you want to darken something, remember that if you've gone too far one way and it doesn't get any darker, you can always go in the opposite direction, and you will see just how quickly you can get just another shade in. Again, you guys, I have a video on that as well, where I talk about different styles of shading, and I also have some shading exercises on Patreon. So again, if you're on Patreon, make sure you go and you check them out. So now I'm going down the neck, and I'm still adding more textures that remind us of the And now creating lighter areas, you know, where there's a bit more light being caught on the fur, and some on this side as well. And now I'm going to do the same thing, but using this eraser, which can help me more with the creation of the fur-like texture. And remember, if you don't have a rubber like this, they can be quite expensive. So if you're a beginner, or if you're just trying things out and you don't even know if you want to get into things, seriously, you can just get something like this and then slice a little bit off, and you get a really nice crisp line. Won't last you as long as this, but you know, it's still usable, workable. So as I said, there's that video that I've attached in the corner there. It will go over all of these variations and things to buy, not to buy, and all that stuff. And these are just tiny little finishing touches, you know, maybe deepening the shadow here, cleaning up a highlight there, you know, those sort of things. The reason I'm doing this is because this is the kind of a drawing I want to have a very crisp, very sort of a clean look to it. But if you are working on something and you want to create more of a sort of a smudgy, darker, moodier effect, then you would probably need to do extra smudging rather than cleaning up. So it always depends on what you're after. And you see how now I want to bring just a little bit more shadow across there because it just seems a bit too light. So what I'm doing, I'm not even applying any graphite on, I'm just, with the smudge stick, I'm just carrying it across to the area where I need that to have the most impact. Okay. I hope you enjoyed this, because now I think it's officially done. I hope you enjoyed this video. Don't forget to give it a thumbs up if you did, subscribe, and press the notification bell. Also, if you enjoyed it, make sure to check out my Patreon page, where just for $8 a month you will get to see all the extra videos with extra tips and more relaxation. And you will also get to support me and help me create more videos for you. I hope you have a lovely day, and as always, thank you for drawing with me.